Morning glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada, and greetings to my friends in Israel around the world. I'm Hugh Hewitt in Studio North. Overnight, the Third Lebanon War began as Israel invaded southern Lebanon with the 98th Division Special Operators and other forces about which we are not yet aware. It's the third time Israel has invaded Lebanon, 1982, 2006, and now 2024. There is no definitive explanation of how far and how fast the Israeli Defense Forces will move. There are leaks from American officials who did not want it to happen in the first place and have been wrong at every turn. And it appears that Israel is simply ignoring President Biden, who is, I think, basically incapacitated, as well as Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and Lloyd Austin. And they are doing so because the security of Israel depends upon pushing back Hezbollah, a terrorist organization that's in complete disarray after lightning strikes by Israel over the last 2 weeks on a variety of its operatives, including its Supreme Commander Nasrallah, who was killed over the weekend. But before that, as you can see in a Fox News column, which I have posted over at my Hugh Hewitt account on X and at Fox News at my entitled Israel Unbound, and I lay out in Israel Unbound everything that Israel has done over the last 3 months. And this includes Benjamin Netanyahu's trip to the United States, where Vice President Harris boycotted his speech to Congress, his meetings thereafter, the Prime Minister's meeting with Joe Biden and Harris, and what appears to be his conclusion that Joe Biden is a husk of himself, Kamala Harris is anti-Israel, and I'm going to go back and tell the War Cabinet, the Security Cabinet it's actually called, I'm going to broaden my government, and we're going to go over to the offensive against Hezbollah because we've already defeated Hamas. It's now just a guerrilla force. There are 101 hostages, and Netanyahu and his government committed to getting them back. There is no one to negotiate with. Hamas is just incommunicado. And even the appeasement monkeys at the State Department have said, Hamas isn't responding. So Netanyahu's gone over to the offensive. And he wants the people of Israel to be able to go back to their northern border, back to their towns, rebuild. And I hope the United States Congress sends a significant appropriation to assist in that process. Because they are our ally, and they deserve at least as much help as we give to any other state in the world. And not just military help, in this case, economic help, because it's been a devastated region. Remember, Hezbollah began this war on October 8th, the day after the massacre by Hamas in the south. Two different terrorist organizations, both funded by Iran. A third terrorist organization, Hezbollah, fired another couple of missiles at Israel. They did not hit yesterday, but Israel blew up all. I don't know if there's anything left except to bounce the rubble in Yemen. But if there's rubble to be bounced, Israel's going to do it. Going over to the offensive this way with the 98th Paratrooper Division and supporting tanks and forces. I will talk later with Ambassador David Friedman. His brand new book, One Jewish State, came out last week, and I listened to it over the last couple of days. It's an amazing book. I'll be joined by Dr. Michael Oren as well, former Israeli ambassador to the United States. Senator Tom Cotton will be along. And I'll be talking about tonight's debate between J.D. Vance and Governor Tim Walz. The first question ought to be, gentlemen, your assessment of Israel's actions in the last 3 weeks. That's it. There's no need for any. What do you assess? We will be covering the debate on the Salem News Channel tonight, beginning before the debate at 7 p.m., simulcasting the debate over the Salem Radio Network and the Salem News Channel, and then coming back for special debate coverage on the Salem News Channel. And I will, of course, be here at 6 a.m. in the morning to tell you everything that happened and didn't happen. It will be 3-on-1 again. Remember, Margaret Brennan, Nora O'Donnell are both leftists. And they won't be fair. They can't be fair. CBS isn't organized to be fair. It doesn't matter. Whatever the question is, J.D. Vance ought to talk about the weakness of the Biden administration that has led to a war in Ukraine, the collapse of the Afghanistan 20-year effort, the deaths at Abbey Gate, and now how we have held back our ally Israel for over almost a year. And they've just finally shrugged off Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, Tony Blinken, and Jake Sullivan. And they're going to win. They are winning. And they are not going to stop as America stopped Israel at the gates of Rafah. They ought not to have stopped the first time in April. They ought to have hit Iran hard. None of this might have been necessary. The hostages might have been back if Iran had been hit hard the way that Israel wanted to do until Joe Biden told them to, quote, take the win. We do not know how far the president's incapacity was advance to that moment when that happened. But the key is Israel's gone over to the offensive. Now, a lot of you don't read a lot of military history, and yesterday's conversation between Jack Carr and myself and his co-author, James Knowles, on Targeted Beirut, laid out the fact that we should be rejoicing in the United States over Hezbollah's dismantling. Hezbollah killed many Americans in April of 1983 when they bombed the U.S. Embassy. They killed even more Americans, mostly Marines, in October of 1983. And for 41 years, we've done nothing. There were plans on the table. They were not adopted. Cap Weinberger did not want to strike back at Hezbollah. So for 40 years, those Marines, those diplomats, those Central Intelligence Agency operatives were unavenged. They are now avenged thanks to our ally, Israel. And if there's one thing you do today, go and find the commentary podcast from yesterday. It included, of course, Editor-in-Chief John Podhoretz, Abe Greenwald, the managing editor, Seth Mandel, the senior editor, Christine Rosen, the media columnist for commentary, and a fellow at the AEI and the author of the brand new book that I had talking to you about last week, and The Extinction of Experience, and Matt Continenti, Commentary Magazine, Washington, D.C. columnist. And they had Dan Senor from Call Me Back. And they were in a celebratory mood because Nasrallah was dead. 10 other senior Hezbollah commanders were dead. That followed the assassinations of other senior Hezbollah commanders in the Radwan force, as well as the chief of staff of the military arm of Hezbollah. They're reeling backwards. They have no idea. There is no command and control. Remember the beeper operation followed by the walkie-talkie operation? Well, now Israel's going to destroy all those tunnels south of the Litani River. They're going to wipe out the villages from which an October 7th style invasion was intended to proceed. And they should be doing so with the applause and support of every American who favors peace in the region. When Ambassador David Friedman joins me in hour 3 today after Senator Cotton, we're going to talk about the future of Israel and what the United States ought to support. And it's his opinion that the sovereignty of Israel ought to be extended over Judea and Samaria, referred by most people as the West Bank. But I think I'm going to adopt the Judea and Samaria language. It will take some relearning. I've been broadcasting since 1990 and calling it the West Bank. But we'll talk extensively with David Friedman, both on and after the show. It will be on the podcast today. I do want you to stay tuned to the program throughout. I'll give you updates as Israel, it's mid-afternoon there already, and we will be getting updates as they are allowed through the military censorship that does, in fact, control media in Israel, so we don't know who's doing what where. Do not believe any of the leaks from the State Department. Yesterday, the State Department and maybe some people at the Pentagon and the White House did their best to stop Israel from going in. Then they did their best to try and persuade Israel by leaking the plans. It's dastardly what they did. But tonight's debate ought to begin with, what do you think of what Israel has done in the past month? When Netanyahu, John Podhoretz pointed this out in yesterday's commentary podcast, when Netanyahu was giving his speech to the United Nations, his very direct challenge to the United Nations is a swamp of anti-Semitism. He knew in his head that the bombers were flying towards Beirut. He knew they were about to take out all of the senior leadership of Hezbollah. And he gave that speech with that in mind, and then he went back. Some people asserted it was part of the plan that Nasrallah would have assumed with Netanyahu at the General Assembly in New York he was somehow, quote, safe. He's a killer, so he should never be safe. No killer should ever be safe. And Israel, all strength to the IDF. I'm sure they will wipe out everything in front of them that fights back. Of course, the IDF fighting in the most humane way possible, advised all of the residents of the villages that they were attacking directly to move. If you're in the tunnels, you're going to be assumed to be a combatant. They do not have to worry about Israeli hostages in the tunnels, so they're going to go forward. I also want to remind you that tonight, as the world is on fire, we've got to remember that this debate is being moderated by people who have absolutely no concern for fairness. Their agenda is to save Kamala Harris, who is plummeting in polls across the United States. She gave another vacuous interview, which I will play parts of for you when I come back, on a podcast. She absolutely can't go out in public. Tim Waltz has not given one interview, not one. He did the interview with Dan Amash, not one solo interview. And that should tell you the buffoonery which seems to follow him like a wake follows a ship at sea We'll talk about that coming up. There's a lot ahead. But this morning, the big story, Israel goes over to the defensive in Lebanon, the third Lebanon war. It's really the first Israel-Iran war. And if Israel is struck by Iran a second time, I don't think they will listen to America's pleas to, quote, take the win, especially not from a president who really ought to be removed by the vice president and the cabinet, because it's pretty clear to me he does not have the capacity to be the commander-in-chief. More coming up on this morning's Hugh Hewitt Show. Stay tuned.